In the America of the 1930 seconds, a woman's world was often defined by the four walls of her home. It was a world measured in teaspoons and yards of fabric, a world that smelled of baking bread, floor wax, and laundry soap. Its soundtrack was the gentle tick of a grandfather clock, the murmur of children playing, and the quiet hum of a sewing machine. Her hands were meant for kneading dough, not for shaping steel. Her skills were in sewing straight, invisible seams, not in sealing the pressurized fuselages of high-altitude bomber planes. The roar she was expected to know was that of a vacuum cleaner, not a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine coughing to life. Society had drawn a clear, thick, and seemingly permanent line. Men worked in the loud, dirty, dangerous, and important world of industry, while women managed the quiet, clean, safe, and supportive world of the domestic sphere. It was a line that seemed as fundamental and unchangeable as the landscape itself. Then came a single day that redrew the map of the world and utterly erased that line forever. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A nation that had been slumbering in a comfortable dream of isolation awoke to a world at war. And as millions of men, fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons answered the call to serve, trading their work overalls for military uniforms, the great American industrial machine, the arsenal of democracy, faced a catastrophic existential crisis. The factories that were supposed to build the tanks, ships, and planes needed to win the war were suddenly silent, their assembly lines staffed by ghosts. A gaping, cavernous hole had been torn in the nation's workforce, and there was only one group of people large enough, capable enough, and determined enough to fill it: America's women. What followed was not just a change in employment statistics, it was a profound, earth-shaking social revolution disguised as a patriotic duty. It was the story of how millions of housewives, high school girls, mothers, and daughters stepped out of the kitchen and into the crucible of the factory floor. They were driven by a potent cocktail of emotions, a surge of fierce patriotism, a gnawing worry for their loved ones overseas, and a secret, often unspoken, desire for new experiences, for a paycheck of their own, for a taste of a different kind of life. They would trade their aprons for oily overalls, their sewing needles for pneumatic rivet guns, and in doing so, they would not only help win the greatest war in history, but would also forge a new, powerful, and permanent identity for themselves and for generations of women to come. They became, in a word, legendary. They became Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter, of course, was not a real person. She was a symbol, an icon, a national idea born out of desperation and brilliant propaganda. She first appeared in a popular song in 1942, but her most enduring image came from a powerful Westinghouse poster, displayed not in art galleries, but in the gritty, real-world setting of the factory floor. A woman in a blue work shirt, her hair tied up in a practical yet stylish red and white polka dot bandana, flexing a determined bicep under the bold, declarative slogan, "We can do it." She was a promise and a challenge all at once. The Office of War Information launched a massive campaign to coax women out of their homes. Imagine being a young woman in 1942, seeing one of these posters in a post office. Your world has been one of defined expectations. But here is this image of a woman who is strong, confident, and vital. She isn't asking for permission. She is a statement of fact. The newsreels shown before the feature film depicted smiling women confidently operating massive machinery, their work portrayed as glamorous, clean, and essential. The message was inescapable and deeply personal. Your husband might be fighting with a rifle in the jungles of Guadalcanal, but you could fight with a rivet gun, right? Here in Inglewood, California. A job in a factory was the highest form of patriotism, and America's women answered the call in numbers that were simply staggering. Between 1,940 and 1,945, the percentage of women in the U.S. workforce leaped from 27% to nearly 37%. By the war's end, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home, a statistic that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. This wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. Housewives who had never worked a day in their lives found themselves standing next to single girls fresh out of high school, all of them lined up for newly created, hyper-accelerated training courses. Imagine your first day. You leave your quiet, familiar home and step into a different universe. The factory floor is an assault on the senses, a world away from anything you have ever known. It is a cavernous, cathedral-like space of noise and motion. The sound is a physical force, a wall of noise that hits you in the chest, the deafening, rhythmic chatter of thousands of rivet guns, the high-pitched scream of metal-cutting lathes, the deep, shuddering boom of giant hydraulic presses stamping out sheets of aluminum with the force of an earthquake. The air is thick with smells you can't name, the sharp tang of hot metal, the acrid scent of ozone from welding torches, the pervasive, greasy odor of industrial lubricants. You feel small, lost, and utterly out of place. The few remaining male workers, older men exempt from the draft, look you up and down, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and doubt. You are an imposter in their world. They hand you a rivet gun. It's heavy, cold, and awkward. The foreman gives you a 10-minute lesson, his voice barely audible over the din. Then you're on your own, facing a vast, curved sheet of aluminum that will soon be the fuselage of a B-25 bomber. Your hands are sweating. You pull the trigger. The gun explodes into life with a force that rattles your teeth and shakes your entire body. The noise is terrifying. Your first few rivets are clumsy, crooked. You feel a flush of shame, but then you try again. You learn to brace yourself, to anticipate the kick, to guide the tool with a steady hand. You place a rivet, and then another, and another. And as you look at the neat, strong, perfectly spaced line you've created, a new feeling begins to bloom in your chest, a feeling you've never experienced before, a powerful, deeply personal sense of accomplishment. You are not just helping, you are building. This transformation was happening all across the country. The heart of this revolution was the aircraft industry. Before the war, women made up a mere 1% of the aviation workforce. By 1943, that number had skyrocketed. More than 310,000 women worked in the U.S. aircraft industry, making up an incredible 65% of the industry's total workforce. They were building the very machines that would win the war. The rugged C-47 transport planes, the mighty B-17 flying fortresses, and the nimble P-51 Mustang fighters. As Glenn Martin, a co-founder of the aerospace giant Martin Marietta, told a reporter, "We have women helping design our planes in the engineering departments, building them on the production line, and operating almost every conceivable type of machinery, from rivet guns to giant stamp presses." Some women did take on roles that were seen as more traditionally feminine, yet were no less vital. They meticulously sewed aircraft upholstery or performed the delicate, nerve-wracking task of painting radium onto tiny instrument dials so that pilots could see them in the dark, a job that required a surgeon's steady hand. But many others, perhaps the more adventurous, dove headfirst into the most physically demanding male jobs. They operated massive hydraulic presses, they used overhead cranes to move multi-ton plane parts, and they performed the intricate, color-coded work of wiring the complex electrical systems of a B-25 bomber. There was a quiet poetry in this transition. The same meticulous attention to detail that was required to follow a complex sewing pattern was now applied to reading a wiring schematic. The same patience needed to bake a perfect cake was now used to inspect 1,000 rivets on a bomber's wing. These women weren't just learning new skills. They were translating their existing, domestically honed talents into the language of industrial production. And they didn't do it alone. In the loud, overwhelming environment of the factory, a new kind of community was forged. Lunch breaks were spent sitting on the giant, half-finished nacelle parts of a bomber, unwrapping sandwiches from wax paper. Here, these women from all walks of life, former waitresses, farm girls, housewives, shared stories of their children, read letters from their husbands overseas, and offered each other advice and encouragement. They formed a new kind of sisterhood, one forged in grease, noise, and shared purpose. They had each other's backs, covering for a sick friend, or helping a newcomer who was struggling with a difficult task. This camaraderie was essential, because despite the propaganda posters, the reality was that most American men were deeply reluctant to accept women in these roles. The women proved them wrong, spectacularly wrong. As one foreman at California Consolidated Aircraft famously told the Saturday Evening Post, "Nothing gets by them unless it's right." The United States Department of Labor, in a study that must have shocked the male establishment, found that on average, a male worker drilled 650 holes per day. A female worker drilled 1,000. While the story of Rosie the Riveter is forever linked with aviation, this female workforce surged into every corner of the war industry. They worked in the deafening heat of steel mills, in the sprawling shipyards of California and Maine, and in the automobile factories of Michigan, which had been converted to produce Sherman tanks. They worked in arsenals, making bombs and weaponry, their hands carefully assembling the very instruments of destruction that would be wielded by their loved ones overseas. Yet, for all their essential contributions, they were fighting a two-front war. The first was against the Axis powers. The second was against the sexism and discrimination on their own factory floors. They endured constant harassment from male co-workers and foremen who resented their presence. But most glaringly, they were not treated as equals on payday. Imagine the quiet fury of receiving your pay packet, opening it, and seeing a sum that was barely half of what the man standing next to you earned for doing the exact same job, often not as well. The principle of equal pay for equal work was a distant, radical dream. They were building the tools of democracy while being denied its basic fairness. The end of the war in 1945 brought a new and bittersweet reality. The nation celebrated VJ Day with a euphoric explosion of joy. The men were coming home. But for millions of women, this joyous news was laced with a quiet sense of loss. The same government propaganda machine that had lured them into the factories now gently but firmly pushed them out, running ads that celebrated a woman's true calling as a wife and mother. Imagine your last day. You hang up your oily overalls for the last time. You return your tools. You walk out of the factory gates, leaving behind the roar of the machines and the easy camaraderie of your friends. You trade the power and independence you felt on the assembly line for the familiar quiet of your home. It was a complex emotion, relief from the grueling work, joy at the return of your loved one, but also a profound, undeniable sense of loss for the person you had become. The Rosie the Riveter generation may have largely returned to the kitchen, but they did not return unchanged. They carried with them the quiet knowledge of their own strength and capability. They had seen what they could do, and they would never fully forget it. They raised a generation of daughters who were told stories not just of fairy tales, but of a time when their mothers built bombers. The quiet revolution that began on the factory floors of World War II would, a few decades later, become the roar of the modern women's rights movement. Rosie had shown what was possible. She had proven, once and for all, that they could, indeed, do it.